Hi, we're here in Oxford, England for the Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship. I'm Catherine Cheney, a senior reporter for Devex, and I'm joined by Stephen King, CEO of Luminate. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Catherine.
So we're going to be talking today about media in flux. This is something I care about not just as a journalist who cares deeply about the media industry, but also as someone who writes about international development and this connection between a free and independent media and international development and the well-being of people across the world. That's a very important connection, and one I want to tease out today. But just to get started, I'm familiar with Luminate, based in Silicon Valley. Luminate kind of started out at the Omidyar network, based in Silicon Valley. But can you tell us, what is Luminate?
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you for having me, and I think this is a really important topic, particularly at this time. Luminate is a global philanthropic organisation, and as you say, it spun out of a Omidyar network last year. So I think part of the reason for that was that we saw that the last 2 years, the world has changed really radically. You know, we've had Brexit, the election of Trump, the rising tide of populism which has come around the world, and I think Pierre Omidyar and the board at Omidyar Network sort of said, okay, now's the time actually to create a dedicated organisation to address these issues. So that was the rationale behind Luminate. Also, we wanted to provide support and dedicated support to our investees and our grantees around the world. So we're working in 18 countries. We've invested about $300 million over the last 10 years as part of Omidyar Network and now as Luminate. And we work in sort of 4 main areas, of which independent media is one, and we will come on and talk about that. The others are data and digital rights, and I think this is becoming, again, particularly important at the moment.
Absolutely.
As people are concerned around the weaponization of technology, the increasing misuse of social media and so on. So as we think about people's rights, it's about their rights to data and their control and agency over data. The second is around financial transparency, anti-corruption efforts around the world, and that's always been an important part of our work. Then civic technology and civic empowerment. So we're seeing the use of technology in very negative ways, but there are also positive ways in which technology can help increase responsiveness of government and increase relationships between citizens and government and so on. So those are the 4 areas we work on, and of course independent media is a really important one of those.
Can you talk about some of the strategy that went into these pillars and why independent media is core to the strategy? How did that evolve as one of the core priorities?
I think it's always something we've done. We've always, as we've been grappling with how to hold leaders to account, how to make government more transparent, more accountable, how to get people to participate in that process, independent media is always useful to amplify those issues. So if you have a expose of corruption, the only way you're going to get it out there is for independent media to spread that word. And there's many examples of where we supported organizations that have then partnered with independent media to amplify those issues. And when it gets into the public eye, generally governments and leaders react. And I think we've also seen, as independent media becomes more effective, that authoritarian governments try and close it down.
Right.
And I think we've seen this, not only in places like the Philippines with Rappler, for example, which is a great digital media platform run by inspiring journalist Maria Ressa. As soon as she became very critical of Duterte's regime, they found lots of different ways to close her down. And she's now facing, I think, 11 different court cases, which are essentially there to silence the media.
I actually want to zoom in on that case in the Philippines, which I've been following with great interest. So I'd love to talk about, well, first of all, can you talk about Luminate's work on this issue in the Philippines? How are you engaged in the Philippines?
So, we've been investors in Rappler, so for the last number of years, and we've also supported investigative journalism in the Philippines through different models and different organizations, the Philippines Center for Investigative Journalism and so on.
Okay, great.
So, it's ironic as well that the Philippines was one of the original signatories to the Open Government Partnership, back in 2011, and it's always been seen within the context of Southeast Asia as one of the as one of the sort of beacons for press freedom, and of course those freedoms have been chipped away, I think, over the last sort of 4 or 5 years.
And I guess one of the things that points to, and I'd love to talk about, is the opportunity for philanthropy and the role that philanthropy can play in these issues, but also the limits of philanthropy. So can you just talk about that a little bit? So whether it's in the Philippines or if you want to pick another country where you're working, can you highlight how philanthropy has a role to play, but other areas, like, for example, who's in government, is so critical.
No, of course. And I think philanthropy has an important role. I think particularly if there is flexible and sort of core funding that's available. So, many, this is also tied up, I think, with the sort of, the increasing problems around business models as well, is that, ad-driven.
Wanted to make sure to get to that.
Ad-driven revenues and so on are failing, partly because social media is hoovering up all the ad revenues. So increasingly, we need to look for alternative revenue sources. But I think where philanthropy can help, I think, is to provide that kind of core support to supplement these other kinds of sources of revenue. Plus, also, I think to support innovation as well, and experimentation. So one of the things we're doing to the revenue point is we've set up a fund with with NYU, New York University, called the Membership Puzzle. And so
I didn't actually know that you had a relationship with that. I follow the Membership Puzzle with great interest, but can you tell us what it is?
So that's essentially a pot of money which is run by NYU, and it allows independent media platforms to apply for essentially experiment money. So if they want to set up membership schemes, subscription schemes as an alternative way of raising revenue, then the Membership Puzzle will give them that sort of seed capital to do that. And we've increasingly seen, different sort of platforms around the world, different media platforms, use membership as an increasingly large and more reliable source of revenue. And I think also it enables a better relationship with their readers as well. There's one called the Ken in India, which we've supported, which is now, it's a sort of business-focused platform, and it's now entirely sustainable by membership and by subscriptions. The Correspondent as well in Holland is another example.
And I've been watching closely their expansion to the US and their plans to do that work. So talking about membership for a moment, I agree it's a promising model for media organizations trying to find a sustainable model. Devex is membership based, and we actually just launched a premium product membership, a premium membership product called Devex Pro. So we're looking at this space. And I also work with a nonprofit called the Solutions Journalism Network, and we're actively following this space and figuring out how solutions journalism can be part of a membership model. I wanted to talk for a second about, I know at the Omidyar Network, part of what makes that such a unique institution is the use of both grants and investments. So can you talk about whether that factors into the Luminate model and what the thought process around that was? Yeah,
so we have that dual checkbook. So we're able to give grants, which is frankly the largest sort of proportion of our work. Probably about 85% of our annual giving is through grants. But then we also have the opportunity to make equity investments as well. And so we do that from time to time. In fact, independent media is probably one of those, out of those four pillars I described, it's the one where we're seeing most opportunities for for-profit investments. And then the other is the civic tech and civic empowerment pillar. So that is very much a part of the toolbox. I think the other thing to consider, though, is how do we also provide non-financial support? Because, I mean, of course, money is critically important, and flexible, unrestricted money is doubly important, I think. But the other element is kind of sometimes these organizations need advice on things like membership, on subscriptions, on alternative business models. And so that's, I think, where other philanthropists and other philanthropies need to be a little bit more creative in the kind of support they give. I think there's a natural reaction, of course, to say, okay, let's give them a grant of $50,000 or whatever, and that's the end of the story. But I think helping organizations grow and develop, whether they be independent media ones or any of the non-profits that we support, and also for-profits, you need to accompany that with dedicated non-financial support as well.
It makes a lot of sense. I want to understand, so you have kind of these three pillars within your media strategy of press freedom, investigative journalism, and exploring new business models.
That's right.
Let's talk about press freedom. And I would love to hear what your experience has been like working in philanthropy around press freedom. What are some of the opportunities and what are some of the big challenges?
And I think it's a critically important issue, and it's getting more and more important. I mean, I think Freedom House had said that there's only 13% of the world's population who live in countries that have a free press. And of course, for all the reasons we talked about earlier, how important it is to have an independent and critical media that can hold governments to account is really a critical pillar of democracy. But I think the discussion around press freedom has got very outdated.
That's an interesting point.
There is also, I think, a cynicism from the public around, press freedom and journalists. And partly that's also been fueled by populism. We only have to see President Trump and various others who are demonizing the media and who are undermining the credibility of the media and the media's role in society to appreciate that. So I think there needs to be a new approach to how we think about press freedom. And I think we need to remind people of how important it is to have a free press.
Right.
There is, of course, whilst we can always celebrate the great examples like Watergate and so on of where press freedom has worked, people also have that experience of journalists, which is them raking around in dustbins and misinformation and disinformation and outright lies. So there isn't a lot of sympathy for journalists. I think that is the root of the problem as well.
Yeah.
So we need to reframe that argument, I think.
Well, you were talking about how the Philippines was once a beacon for press freedom, and similar with the US. I mean, having worked in journalism my career so far, I think we often take our press freedom for granted, and yet from our very country we're getting signals from the government that there isn't a lot of support for the work that we do. What I was really struck by in a session here yesterday at the Skoll World Forum is that this is having ripple effects internationally. So there was a panel called Journalists Under Fire, and an investigative journalist from Ghana who actually has to disguise his identity because of the important work that he does for his safety, talked about how President Trump and his comments and around the media and treatment of the media have ripple effects that really threaten the work and lives of journalists in other countries. So I guess I'd just love to hear from you. You mentioned that the discussion around press freedom is outdated, and I think that's a really powerful point. How do you convey to people the urgency of this? For example, the fact that the consequences cross borders.
Yeah. So I think partly it's through reminding people of the good work that people like Anas, who you mentioned from Ghana, have done. Quite extraordinary undercover investigations, very brave work that has essentially helped to expose corruption. There was, I think, he uncovered scandals around judges fixing trials and so on, and taking money for that in Ghana. So the hope there is that the discovery of those crimes then has a response from government,
right?
And the government is shocked, and the public are appalled, and they then demand change. I think the problem we're seeing at the moment, and President Trump is part of this, and other authoritarian leaders, is they're undermining the credibility of the press to do that good work,
right?
Because they're also giving license to other authoritarian governments to reintroduce censorship, to suggest that good journalists are also purveyors of fake news. So this whole term around fake news, the wave of misinformation and disinformation cuts away at the sort of credibility of journalism as a sector, and so therefore it becomes less believable, and it can be easily challenged. And I think we've seen the Committee to Protect Journalists has said that there's now more than 250 journalists who've been arrested, and this is the third consecutive year, or who are in prison at the moment. I think it's 53 that were killed last year. That's been up from 47 in 2017. So these are worrying trends, and what we don't want to see is that this becomes the norm. Is that attacks on journalists, attacks on journalism become the norm, and it becomes an estate that has no credibility and has no leverage. Yeah,
Joel Simon from the Committee to Protect Journalists was on this panel yesterday, and sharing some statistics and kind of the stakes of the moment that we're in. And it's easy to lose hope and think that we're not moving in a positive direction. So I do want to know, though, do you see bright spots? I think when it comes to, and it's part of what I talk about in terms of a solutions journalism approach, when it comes to really problem-ridden topics like press freedom, it's really easy to lose hope if the narrative is just constantly what's wrong, and there's a lot that's wrong. But if we can look to bright spots, things that are working, there's some hope that we can kind of move forward. What do you see as the bright spots?
So I think solutions journalism is a bright spot, and I think that's something which we've been supportive of and will continue to be supportive of. I think there's also much more collaboration in journalism now than there was before.
There is,
and so the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, who produced the Panama Papers and Paradise Papers, that was a great example of journalists who are not known for collaboration, actually working together for the common good. And you had large papers like Süddeutsche Zeitung and The Guardian keeping their tendency would be to go, let's go for the scoop,
right?
And let's publish before everybody else. But I think what was really good to see with the Panama Papers is that they all worked together on this project for many months, and they all kept the data under wraps because they knew the power of the larger story. And so I think those are the kind of bright spots, some of the bright spots we're seeing. I think also the emergence of digital platforms like Rappler and others around the world, which I think are starting to, we're seeing common threads. We're also seeing the emergence of a community of practice and also sharing problems, sharing ideas. And that's part of also the role that I think philanthropists can play, is how do we put Rappler in touch with Anas in Ghana? How do we support those brave investigative journalists, Amu Bagani in South Africa? And how do we put them in touch with others and so on?
I've seen that trend absolutely in philanthropy around journalism, is helping to foster collaboration at this time. I want to understand what some of your big challenges are. So I know we only have a few minutes left, but what are the challenges you're facing? I anticipate one might be defining what is journalism, who is a journalist.
That's always an issue. I think. I mean, one of the bigger challenges I think is the role of social media. And I was at a conference last week. Larry Kramer from the Hewlett Foundation talked about if we go back to 1964 and we wanted to publish a piece of hate speech, where would we go? You go to the Ku Klux Klan, or you go to some other sort of fringe group, and you may publish a pamphlet or something, but you wouldn't get very far, mercifully. Now anyone can publish, and anyone can publish really with impunity. So, and I think part of what we're now starting to see is a greater awareness of the social media platforms' responsibilities. And you're seeing this with draft legislation here in the UK. We've seen this in Germany, we've seen this in New Zealand and Australia, of course, after the sort of terrible tragedies with the Christchurch mosque and so on, is that there is a much greater awareness now of editorial responsibility. So our hope is that we'll return to a time, or we'll make people more aware of the values of editorial responsibility and of people's responsibility to be respectful of other people and to publish in that kind of vein, I think.
So given these challenges, and that was well put, it seems like one of the dynamics in press freedom philanthropy is that, as I heard it put to me earlier today, it's press freedom people talking to press freedom people. And with, as you confront these challenges, how are you trying to bring other people in and kind of get new players in this space?
No, and I think that has been part of the issue. Is it's an echo chamber. Is preaching to the converted. I think there's a couple of things. Number one, we need to be better coordinated as philanthropists. And there is a fair amount of cooperation, but I think there are many opportunities there. Much more funding needs to come into the sector. There's a handful of funders and philanthropists, and Luminate is one of them. Open Society Foundation, Forward, and others who are supporting this kind of work worldwide, but they're few and far between. What's encouraging is that the international community is starting to wake up.
It's good to hear.
So the British Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt is organising an international conference on press freedom in July in London in partnership with the Canadian government. So as governments start to see these as signature issues, then I think there is the possibility of broadening that audience out. And then also the media themselves, the editors, they have a responsibility as well. So it is important that this becomes a mainstream issue, and it's important also, I think, that we don't let the persecution of journalists and journalism become the norm, and also that journalism is not undermined.
As we've discussed, the implications are cross-cutting. So I think we're nearly out of time, and I just wanted to end with any final calls to action. So whether it's philanthropists tuning in, civil society organizations tuning in, journalists tuning in, whether they believe in this and they're kind of already on board with you, or maybe they need to be convinced. What are some calls to action you have?
I mean, I think this is, as we've seen, the way in which the world has changed over the last couple of years, I think has underlined the importance of these issues. So we've never been in a situation where there's been such direct threats to journalists and journalism and the freedom of information more generally. So I think it's really incumbent on whether it's journalists, civil society, government and so on, to take a step back and think, what are we at risk of squandering here? What are we willing to make those deals where we say, as Larry Diamond at Stanford said, are we prepared for a postmodern totalitarianism where we say, okay, it's not that important, individual freedom, but we've got, a house and a car and whatever. I don't think many of us want to live in that kind of society.
I don't want to.
No.
So powerful call to action. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for tuning in.